I only married him for your mother's money, Ethan. Do you really think I'd stay in this dusty old house for love? The words didn't just drift through the crack in the study door. They sliced. I stood in the hallway, my hand still resting on the silver tray I'd prepared. On it were 2 cups of chamomile tea and the almond biscotti Clara liked so much. The ones I'd driven 30 minutes across town to get because she mentioned she missed them. I didn't drop the tray. I didn't gasp. I simply stopped breathing for a second. My house, the one Charles and I spent 40 years turning into a home, suddenly felt like a stranger's property. The mahogany walls, the Persian rugs, the scent of lavender furniture polish. It all felt cold. Clara, keep your voice down. Ethan's voice followed, hushed and strained. My mother is just in the kitchen. If she hears you, and what if she does? Clara's laugh was a sharp, brittle sound that set my teeth on edge. She's 65, Ethan. She spends half her time talking to the roses in the garden and the other half staring at your father's old watch. She's not listening. She's fading. And frankly, I'm tired of waiting for her to realize that this house is an asset, not a museum. I looked down at the tea. The steam was rising in thin, elegant spirals. I thought about the way Clara had hugged me when they arrived last month, the way she called me Mom with such practiced sweetness, the way she insisted on helping me reorganize the pantry only to throw away Charles's old spice tins because they were cluttered. I had let it go. For Ethan, my son, my only child. The man who was now standing in a room built with his father's sweat, listening to his wife describe his mother as a fading shadow. He didn't defend me. He didn't tell her to leave. He just told her to be quiet. I felt a familiar weight in my chest. Not the heaviness of grief I'd carried that since Charles died 3 years ago, but something sharper. A quiet, icy clarity. They thought I was a placeholder, a signature on a trust fund, a dumb old lady who didn't understand that the world had changed. I didn't enter the room. I didn't confront them with tears or accusations. Instead, I turned around, slowly, carefully. I walked back to the kitchen, placed the tray on the counter, and poured both cups of tea down the sink. The hot liquid swirled away, leaving nothing but the faint scent of herbs and a hollow silence. They wanted my money? They wanted my house? I looked at my reflection in the window above the sink. My hair was white, my face was lined, but my eyes were the same ones that had helped Charles build a business from nothing while raising a son who apparently forgot where he came from. The game had started, but Clara was wrong about one thing. I wasn't fading. I was just getting started. The night didn't end with fireworks, just silence. After the tea went down the drain, I walked back into the living room. Ethan and Clara were already there, settled into the velvet sofa like they had spent years earning their place on it. They didn't even look up when I entered. "Mom, did you forget the tea?" Ethan asked, his eyes never leaving the screen of his phone. "The water wasn't right," I said softly. "I'll try again tomorrow." Clara gave a small, performative sigh. "You've been so forgetful lately, Catherine. Maybe it's the stress of this big house. It's a lot to manage, isn't it?" I didn't answer. I just sat in Charles's old armchair, the one Clara had suggested moving to the attic last week because it didn't fit the aesthetic. My fingers traced the worn leather of the armrest. This chair had held Charles for 40 years. It had held me through the first year of my widowhood. Now, it felt like an island in a sea that was slowly rising. Dinner that night was a quiet affair. I had prepared a pot roast, the way Charles liked it. Clara barely touched it, pushing the carrots around her plate with a look of mild disgust. "We really need to talk about the Wi-Fi," Clara said, breaking the silence with the sharpness of a glass shattering. I changed the password to something more secure. "You don't mind, do you?" I noticed some strange activity on the router. She hadn't asked. She had simply cut my connection to the outside world and called it security. I looked at Ethan, my son, who once used to hold my hand when we crossed the street. He was busy cutting his meat, avoiding my gaze. He knew his wife was slowly stripping the layers of my life away, one password and one piece of furniture at a time. "It's fine," I replied, my voice as steady as the grandfather clock in the hall. "I don't spend much time online anyway." That was a lie. I spent my evenings reading the news, looking at old photos, and checking the balance of the trust Charles had left for me. Later, as I climbed the stairs to my room, I heard them whispering again in French, the language Clara thought I didn't understand. "Elle est comme un fantôme," Clara whispered. A ghost. I stopped on the landing, my hand tightening on the banister. A ghost? No. A ghost is a memory of someone who is gone. I was still here, and as I closed my bedroom door, I realized that if they wanted to play a game of shadows, I was the one who knew every corner of this house in the dark. The house used to breathe with me, but now it felt like it was holding its breath. The next morning, I woke up early, not because I had to, but because the silence in the hallway felt too heavy. I walked down to the kitchen and found the mail sitting on the mahogany counter. It was already opened. One envelope, from the bank that holds Charles's primary trust, had been sliced clean across the top. I picked it up. My hands didn't shake. I simply looked at the jagged edge of the paper. This wasn't a mistake. It was a message. "Oh, good morning, Catherine," Clara's voice floated in from the patio. She was wearing one of my silk robes one Charles had bought for me in Venice. It was too long for her, the hem dragging slightly on the floor. "I saw the mail arrived. I thought I'd help you sort through the junk." "This wasn't junk, Clara," I said, my voice as flat as the counter. "It's my quarterly statement." She didn't blink. She just took a sip of her green smoothie, the one that smelled of grass and arrogance. "Ethan and I were just worried you might miss a payment. You've been so distracted lately. We thought it might be easier if we moved all the bills to our digital account." "Easier for whom?" I watched her walk toward the cabinet where I kept my fine china. She reached for a teacup, a delicate, hand-painted piece from my mother, and used it to measure out her protein powder. "Clara," I said softly, "that cup is 100 years old. It's just porcelain, Catherine," she replied without looking back. "Things are meant to be used, not worshipped." I looked at Ethan, who had just entered the room. He was wearing a new watch, a gold one, the kind of gold that screams rather than whispers. He didn't look at me. He went straight to the coffee maker I had bought him for his graduation. "Did you see the statement, Ethan?" I asked. He paused, his thumb hovering over the start button. "Clara mentioned it. We're just trying to streamline things, Mom. You shouldn't have to worry about numbers at your age." At my age. As if 65 was a death sentence for the brain. I walked over to the hallway closet where I kept Charles's old leather-bound ledgers. When I opened the door, my heart skipped a beat. They were gone. In their place were Clara's designer handbags, stuffed into the shelves like brightly colored intruders. I didn't scream. I didn't demand to know where my memories had been tossed. I just felt the frost forming on the glass of my heart. They weren't just waiting for me to fade. They were actively erasing the chalk lines of my existence while I was still standing in the room. I went back to the kitchen and watched them. They were laughing at something on Ethan's phone, their heads tilted together, a united front. They thought I was the ghost. But ghosts have one advantage. We can see through walls. And I was starting to see exactly what lay behind theirs. I retreated to the second floor, to the only room they hadn't yet managed to streamline Charles's private study. The air in here was different. It didn't smell like Clara's expensive, soulless perfumes. It smelled of old paper, cedarwood, and the faint, lingering scent of the pipe tobacco Charles hadn't smoked in years. It was the scent of a man who built things to last. I sat at his desk, my fingers tracing the deep grain of the oak. He had always told me, "Catherine, the loudest person in the room is usually the weakest. True power is in the silence before the move." I looked at the locked drawer at the bottom of the desk, the one he called his just-in-case drawer. Ethan and Clara probably thought it was filled with old tax returns and useless receipts. They hadn't asked for the key, likely because they didn't think I was capable of hiding anything from them. I pulled the small silver key from the chain around my neck, hidden beneath my silk blouse. Inside was a folder, thick and bound in leather. It wasn't just bank statements. It was a handwritten letter from Charles, dated only a week before his heart finally gave out. "To my dearest Catherine," the ink was slightly faded, but his handwriting was as firm as ever. "If you are reading this, it means the house has become too quiet, or perhaps too loud with the wrong voices. I know our son. He has a good heart, but he is easily led by those who crave what they haven't earned. I have placed a safety net within the trust. It requires a code that only you and our old friend, Marcus the lawyer, know." I felt a tear prick the corner of my eye, but I didn't let it fall. I wouldn't be by Louis, sorrowful. Not anymore. As I read further, I realized Charles had seen this coming long before I did. He knew the greed that could rot a family from the inside out. He had left me more than just money. He had left me a roadmap for my dignity. Suddenly, The door to the study creaked open. Clara stood there, her eyes narrow, scanning the room. "Oh, Catherine, I didn't realize you were in here. I was thinking this room would make a wonderful home office for Ethan. It's so wasted as it is." I slowly closed the drawer and stood up, the leather folder tucked securely under my arm, hidden by the shadows of my robe. "The room is fine exactly as it is, Clara," I said, my voice as cold and smooth as a river stone. "And Ethan doesn't need a home office. He needs to remember whose home he is actually in." She stiffened, her polite mask slipping for just a fraction of a second. "Is that a threat?" "No," I replied, walking past her without a second glance. "It's a reminder. I think I'll take my walk in the garden now. The roses need pruning, and I've decided I don't like the way the weeds are starting to take over." I walked down the stairs, the weight of the folder against my side giving me a strength I hadn't felt in years. The ghost was starting to find her voice, and it was going to be much louder than a whisper. The following Saturday, the house was no longer mine. It was a stage. Clara had organized an intimate cocktail evening for Ethan's potential business partners. She didn't ask if I minded the noise. She simply handed me a silk dress, 2 sizes too small, and suggested I might be more comfortable staying in my room to avoid the social exhaustion. I didn't stay in my room. I wore my favorite navy Chanel suit, the one Charles bought me for our 30th anniversary, and walked down the stairs. The living room was filled with strangers. Clara was the perfect hostess, floating between groups, her laughter ringing out like a polished bell. When she saw me, her smile didn't falter, but her eyes turned into chips of ice. "Oh, Catherine," she said, loud enough for a nearby couple to hear. "I told you that you didn't need to work tonight. We have caterers for the heavy lifting." I felt the sting before I felt the anger. She was introduced me not as the owner of the house, but as an elderly relative who needed to be managed. I moved toward the kitchen to get a glass of water, feeling the weight of a dozen indifferent glances. That's when I saw Lily, my neighbor's granddaughter, who was helping with the coats. Lily caught my eye and stepped away from the rack. "Mrs. Sterling," she whispered, her voice a warm blanket in this cold room. "I overheard her in the hallway earlier. She was telling the caterers to hide the family photos in the study because they clutter the brand." I tightened my grip on the edge of the counter. The photos of Charles, the photos of our life. "She also told someone on the phone that you were entering a transition phase," Lily continued, her brow furrowed with genuine concern. "She mentioned an estate lawyer coming by on Monday." I looked at Lily. She was young, sharp, and she saw the truth that my own son refused to acknowledge. "Thank you, Lily," I said, my voice barely a murmur. "It's good to know who is still looking." I walked back into the party. I didn't hide. I stood by the piano and watched Clara. She was currently speaking French to a tall man in a gray suit, her gestures animated. "Elle est épuisée," she said, glancing toward me with a pitying look. "Bientôt, nous aurons tout l'espace dont une toy avons besoin." She is exhausted. "Soon, we will have all the space we need." I took a slow sip of my water. I didn't interrupt her. I didn't make a scene. Clara thought she was playing a game of speed, racing to erase me before I noticed I was gone. But I was playing a game of endurance. Monday was coming. And if she wanted a lawyer, I would make sure she got exactly what she deserved, a lesson in ownership. Monday morning arrived with a gray, persistent mist that clung to the windows. Clara was already gone, likely meeting the estate lawyer Lily had mentioned, while Ethan was buried in his home office, my husband's study, thinking he was the master of all he surveyed. I didn't stay to watch the mist. I drove to a part of town where the buildings were made of weathered brick and the history was deeper than a digital bank account. Marcus was waiting for me. He was as old as Charles would have been, with hands that had signed more deeds than Clara had spent dollars. He looked at me over his spectacles, and for the first time in months, I didn't feel like a ghost. "Charles always said you'd come, Catherine," he said, his voice like the crackle of old parchment. "He knew that love can sometimes blind a man, but it never blinds a woman who has built a life from the ground up." He laid out the original trust documents on the mahogany table. My eyes traced the signatures. Charles's bold stroke. Mine, elegant and firm. "The safety net Charles mentioned," Marcus continued, tapping a specific clause in the folder I had brought, "is a conditional occupancy and management clause. It states that if the primary resident U is deemed unfit or assisted without a formal medical evaluation from a board-certified physician of your choosing, the trust immediately freezes all external access. I felt a cold shiver of relief. Clara had been trying to label me as fading, to bypass this very gate. And the house? I asked. The deed is tied to the trust, Marcus said. As long as you are the trustee, no one can sell a single brick, not Ethan, especially not his wife. I looked at the documents, then at Marcus. I thought about the way Clara had changed the Wi-Fi password, the way she had tossed Charles's spice tins, and the way Ethan had stood by and watched it happen. I want to activate the audit, Marcus, I said, my voice barely a whisper but as hard as iron. Every penny spent from the joint account in the last 90 days, every attempt to access the principal. It will cause a storm, Catherine, he warned. Let it, I replied. I've spent too much time trying to stay dry while they were pouring the water. As I drove home, the mist began to lift. I wasn't just a woman with memories anymore. I was a woman with a plan. I arrived back to find Clara in the kitchen, her face glowing with a triumphant light. She held a stack of papers in her hand, her silk robe billowing as she turned to me with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. Catherine, dear, she chirped. I've had a wonderful idea for your future comfort. We should talk about the new arrangements. I walked past her, my hand grazing the mahogany counter that I had polished for 40 years. I agree. Clara, I said, pausing at the hallway. We certainly should, but first, check your email. Marcus just sent over a few things you might find interesting. The silence that followed was the first real peace I had felt in weeks. The scream didn't come immediately. It was a low, guttural sound of realization that vibrated through the floorboards of the kitchen. I was upstairs, slowly hanging Charles's coats back in the hallway closet, displacing Clara's designer bags without a sound when I heard it. What is this, Ethan? Look at this. Clara's voice was no longer a polished bell. It was a serrated blade. I walked to the top of the stairs and looked down. Clara was standing by the mahogany counter, her laptop open, her face a pale, distorted mask of rage. Ethan stood beside her, looking at the screen with the bewildered expression of a man who had just realized the ground beneath him was made of thin ice. The trust accounts. They're locked, Ethan stammered, his voice thin. Every transaction for the last 3 months is under audit. My business credit card just declined. Clara turned on him, her eyes flashing with a venom I had only glimpsed in the shadows. You told me she was fading, Ethan. You said she didn't know anything about the finances. Now I can't even pay the deposit for the new New York apartment. I didn't know, Ethan whispered. I descended the stairs slowly, my hand grazing the banister Charles had polished for decades. I didn't rush. I didn't need to. Is there a problem, Clara? I asked, my voice as calm as a frozen lake. She spun around, pointing a trembling finger at me. You did this. You went behind our backs to that old man Marcus. You're trying to ruin us. I am securing what is mine, I said, stopping at the bottom step. And I believe it was you who went behind my back, trying to declare me unfit while sleeping in my silk robes and drinking from my mother's china. Clara took a step toward me, her polite facade completely shattered. You think you're so clever. You're just a bitter old woman clinging to a dead man's ghost. You're a burden, Catherine, a gong-nong burden that we were this close to fixing. Ethan finally spoke, his voice cracking. Clara, stop. That's enough. No, it's not enough, she shrieked, switching to French, thinking her anger would be shielded by the language. Tu es une vieille folle. Tu ne mérites rien. You are a crazy old woman. You deserve nothing. I looked her directly in the eye and answered in the same language. My accent perfect, my tone icy. Je mérite le respect dans ma propre maison. Et toi? Tu mérites de faire tes valises. I deserve respect in my own home. And you? You deserve to pack your bags. The silence that followed wasn't just quiet. It was a vacuum. Clara's jaw dropped. Ethan stared at me as if he were seeing me for the first time in 10 years. I didn't stay to watch her cry or hear his excuses. I walked back to the kitchen, picked up the opened bank statement, and placed it neatly in the trash. The mask was off, the lines were drawn, and for the first time since Charles died, I felt like the master of my own house again. The house became a battlefield where no one fired a shot, but every word was a landmine. For the next 3 days, I became a shadow in my own home, practicing the silence Charles had always praised. I watched from the upper landing as Clara and Ethan huddled in the living room. The air around them was thick with desperation, the kind that smells like stale coffee and whispered lies. Clara no longer wore my silk robes. She wore her resentment like a suit of armor, her movements sharp and jagged. She tried to play the victim, her voice dropping to a theatrical sob whenever I entered a room, hoping to pull Ethan back to her side. "We can't let her do this, Ethan." I heard her hiss one evening while I stood in the dark of the pantry. "She's not herself. The lawyers, the audit. It's elder abuse against us. She's trying to cut you out of your own inheritance." I didn't intervene. I didn't defend myself. I simply watched as my son, my only child, looked at the floor, torn between the woman he had married and the mother who had built his world. I spent my afternoons in the garden, pruning the dead weight from the roses with steady hands. I wasn't just gardening, I was documenting. Every attempt Clara made to access my private files, every frantic call she made to the bank from the hallway, was noted. I had replaced the old Wi-Fi router with one she couldn't bypass. One afternoon, I caught her in the kitchen, staring at the empty drawer where the silverware used to be, the ones I had already moved to the safety of Marcus's vault. "Where is it?" she asked, her voice trembling with a cold, dry rage. "Where is everything?" I placed my gardening shears on the counter. The metal clinked against the stone, a sharp, final sound. "It's safe, Clara," I said, my voice as calm as a winter morning. "Everything in this house has a place, and for the first time in a long time, everything is exactly where it belongs." She looked at me then, and for the first time, I saw it. Fear. She realized she wasn't dealing with a fading widow. She was dealing with the woman who had survived Charles Sterling, and who had no intention of being erased by a girl who mistook silence for weakness. The audit results were due tomorrow. The game of shadows was over. It was time to bring the light. Dưới đây là nội dung. Phần 9 được xây dựng dựa trên cấu trúc của dạng thu Volsa. Các kỹ thuật viết đã được training. Văn phong tập trung vào sự điềm tĩnh, quyền lực và nhịp truyện cao trào. Breakthrough. I didn't plan a confrontation. I planned a dinner. The table was set exactly as it had been for 40 years. The white linen cloth, the heavy silver forks, and the crystal glasses that caught the evening light. I had spent the afternoon preparing Charles's favorite roast, the scent of rosemary and garlic filling the house like a memory brought back to life. Ethan and Clara sat across from me, their faces tight with a tension that made the air feel thin. They hadn't spoken since the audit began, their movements around each other now cautious and brittle. "I've received the final report from Marcus today," I said, my voice steady as I carved the meat. Clara's fork clattered against her plate. "And? I suppose you're going to tell us more lies about how we've been mismanaging things?" I didn't look up. I placed a perfect slice of roast on her plate. "The audit shows that over $50,000 were moved from the Joint Maintenance Fund to a private account in the Cayman Islands. An account under your name, Clara." Ethan froze. He looked at his wife, his mouth opening but no sound coming out. "It was for our future, Ethan," Clara hissed, her composure finally snapping. "I was protecting us. Your mother is hoarding a fortune that belongs to you." "It belongs to the trust," I corrected softly, finally meeting her gaze. "And the trust is for the care of this house and my livelihood. It is not a startup fund for a life you haven't earned." I reached into my pocket and pulled out 2 envelopes. I placed them on the mahogany table. "Inside, these are the results of the formal medical evaluation I took yesterday," I said. The board-certified physician Marcus suggested. "I am, as the report states, of perfectly sound mind." "Sharp as a tack, I believe," he said. I pushed the envelopes toward them. "Clara, you came into this house thinking my silence was a sign of decay," I said, leaning back in my chair. "You thought you could erase me while I was still breathing the same air. But you forgot that a house built on a solid foundation doesn't fall just because a few weeds try to take over the garden." "Ethan," I looked at my son, the boy who used to draw me cards with crayons. "You have a choice. You can stay in this house and learn what it means to be a Sterling. Or you can leave with the woman who only married you for a bank account she can no longer touch." The silence that followed was the heaviest I had ever known. Clara looked at the envelope, then at the gold watch on Ethan's wrist, the one I knew was now a symbol of her failure. The dinner was cold, but the clarity was burning bright. The candles on the table burned low, their wax dripping like slow, silent tears onto the linen. I had spent years bleaching to a perfect white. Clara didn't scream this time. The revelation of the Cayman account had drained the color from her face, leaving her looking small and hollow. She stared at the envelope I had pushed toward her as if it were a venomous thing. "Ethan, she started, her voice a fragile whisper. But she couldn't find a lie big enough to cover the truth anymore. Ethan didn't look at her. He was staring at his own hands, the hands of a man who had allowed his wife to strip his mother's life away while he looked the other way. The silence in the room was no longer a battle. It was a wake. "Did you know?" Ethan finally asked, his voice cracking like dry wood. "About the account, Clara? Did you really think my mother was that invisible?" Clara reached for his arm, her polished nails catching the light, but Ethan flinched away. That small movement, the pulling back, was the loudest sound in the house. I stood up slowly, my movements deliberate and calm. I didn't feel the rush of victory I had expected. Instead, I felt a profound, heavy stillness. "I'm going to my room now," I said, my voice as steady as the grandfather clock in the hall. "Tomorrow morning, I expect the keys to the study and the guest room to be on the kitchen counter." "Mom, wait," Ethan called out, his eyes red-rimmed and full of a shame he was finally forced to swallow. "Not tonight, Ethan," I replied, without turning back. "Tonight, you need to decide if you are a guest in this house or accomplice in its destruction." I walked up the stairs, my shadow stretching long and thin against the mahogany walls. Behind me, I heard the sound of a chair scraping back and the muffled, desperate sobbing of a woman who had finally run out of languages to hide behind. I closed my bedroom door and sat in the dark. The house felt different now. The air was clearing, the frost was melting, but the structures left behind were scarred. Clara thought I was a ghost, but ghosts don't feel the cold. And as I sat there, listening to the muffled arguments downstairs, I realized that reclaiming my life meant I had to watch the one I had built for my son break apart. The next morning, the sun rose with a cold, piercing brightness that left no room for shadows. I found the keys on the mahogany counter at exactly 8 a.m. They were cold to the touch. Beside them sat a single suitcase, Clara's, and a note that had been torn and taped back together. She didn't come down for breakfast. She didn't offer a final mercy. I stood by the window and watched as a black car pulled into the driveway. Clara walked out, her head low, the silk robe she had once stolen from my closet replaced by a stiff, gray trench coat. She looked like a stranger who had overstayed her welcome at a hotel. She didn't look back at the house. She didn't look at Ethan, who stood on the porch with his arms crossed, his posture crumbling like a house of cards. When the car disappeared around the bend, the silence that returned to the hallway was different. It wasn't heavy anymore. It was clean. Ethan walked into the kitchen, his footsteps heavy and uncertain. He looked at the empty space where Clara's things had been, then at me. "She's gone to stay with her sister in New York," he said, his voice barely a murmur. "She wants me to follow her. She says we can still make it work if we find our own way." I poured a cup of coffee and pushed it toward him. "And what do you want, Ethan?" He sat down, the gold watch on his wrist looking like a heavy shackle. "I want to stop feeling like I've lost my father twice," he whispered. I reached across the table and placed my hand over his. I didn't say it was okay. I didn't tell him I forgave him yet. The price of his silence was the ruin of his marriage, and the price of Clara's greed was the loss of a life she never appreciated. "You can stay here while you figure it out," I said softly. "But the locks have been changed, Ethan. And this time, only I have the key." He didn't argue. He just took a sip of the coffee and cried quietly into the steam. The frost was gone, but the garden still needed a lot of work. A week has passed since the house exhaled its last bit of tension. The mornings are different now. They are quiet, but it is a fertile quiet, the kind that allows you to hear your own thoughts again. I woke up today and didn't check the hallway for whispers or the kitchen for rearranged drawers. I simply watched the sun crawl across the mahogany floor. Charles and I had polished together a lifetime ago. Ethan stayed. He has spent the last few days in the garden, his hands caked in the same dark earth that Charles used to love. He hasn't asked for the keys back, and he hasn't mentioned Clara's name. This afternoon, I prepared a simple meal. No continental cooking, no protein powders measured out in heirlooms, just a roast chicken and the silver gravy boat that was my mother's. I took my seat at the head of the table. For months, I had shrunk myself to make room for people who didn't know how to carry the weight of this family's legacy. I had played the ghost in my own hallways, But as I looked at Ethan sitting across from me, I realized that my silence wasn't a sign of fading. It was a period of observation. "The roses look better," Ethan said, his voice finally finding its old warmth. "They just needed the dead weight removed," I replied gently. We ate in a silence that didn't sting. It was the silence of a home being rebuilt, one brick of trust at a time. After dinner, I walked into the study and opened the bottom drawer of Charles's desk. I looked at the photo of us in Nice, the Mediterranean sun turning everything to gold. I didn't cry. I smiled. Clara thought I was a gone-nung burden, a relic of a time that had passed. She thought she could use a language I didn't understand to build a wall between me and my life. She was wrong. I am Catherine Sterling. I am the owner of this house, the keeper of these memories, and the woman who knows exactly when to speak and when to let the silence do the work. I closed the drawer and locked it. The key is around my neck, where it has always belonged. I am not fading. I am exactly where I am meant to be.